Welcome back to the story of my ancestors. In this video, we'll take a look at my paternal grandmother, Jessie McDonald Radcliff. Now, Jessie was the grandparent that my siblings and I knew the best. She lived to age 94 and passed away in 1986 when my siblings and I were all adults. In fact, Jessie had the opportunity to meet 3 of her great-grandchildren. Now, Jessie was born, according to this birth certificate from the town of Granville, Massachusetts, on February 5th of 1892. However, Jessie always celebrated her birthday on February 4th. That was the date that my mother Betty had on her calendar, and when we found Jessie's birthday book, where she had the birthdays of all of her friends and relatives, she had the 4th listed as her own birth date. So we never had the chance to ask on that. My father had passed at the point that my mother and I discovered that. But officially, she was born on February 5th, but we always celebrated on February 4th. Now, Jessie was one of 11 children born to James and Ida Marie Green McDonald. 3 of those children that you see here died in infancy, and so Jessie grew up as one of 8 surviving children. There were 7 girls and 1 boy, Charles or Charlie, who was born last. And so Jessie was the seventh in line of the 8 surviving children. Now, I hadn't realized until doing this research that Jessie's mother, Ida, died when Jessie was just 6 years old. She was raised by her sisters as well as her father. However, her sisters began marrying and moving away as they were as much as 12 years older than Jessie, shortly after her mother's death. We have no photos of the family or of Jessie from her childhood. And the first photo that we have of Jessie is when she graduated from high school in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1911, as you see here. Now, one of the very interesting pieces is at this point, she apparently was not living with her father. We have census records from 1910 that show Jessie living with Samuel Roberts and his family in Springfield, and she is listed as a servant. And we do know that by the time she came to Connecticut a few years later, that she was working as a live-in maid. And so, again, we know very little of her childhood, but have just those 2 little glimpses. In a future video, we'll talk some about Jessie's sisters and who they married and who some of the cousins are we grew up around, and her brother Charlie and his family. But in this video, we're going to move back to the story of Jessie as she moved from Massachusetts down to the Bristol-Plainville area. Now, 2 of her sisters, Jenny and Anna, known as Nan, had both married men from Bristol and were living in this area, so it was kind of natural for Jessie to join them. Now, when she moved here, she went to work for a family on Broad Street in Plainville as a live-in maid. And the story that Jean relates is one that Jessie told of being the one that was trusted in driving the team of horses with the wagon with some of her friends and maybe some of the family that she worked with, up to the dances at the Grange Hall, that social club or rural community club up in Plymouth, which would have been a number of miles away and had a very steep hill going from Bristol to Plymouth, and Jessie was the one that could navigate that. We also have heard some stories about Jessie and Frank going to the dances. I'm not quite sure how they met, but at some point before his enlistment in the Army, they had been dating and going to dances and other social events together. And as I mentioned in the video about Frank, their relationship became more serious while he was in the Army and stationed at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. And they were married in 1918, just before Frank went off to war. Now, we know that when Frank returned, that Jessie had been living with his parents, Daniel and Lizzie Radcliff. And so Frank joined them as they moved into a new house on 43 Forestville Avenue. And that will sound familiar to my siblings anyway. It was the house that we knew as Grandma Radcliffe's house. And in the census for 1920, it shows that in one apartment, Frank and Jessie lived, and I'm assuming that that was the upstairs of the two-family house. And then Daniel and Lizzie lived in the other apartment. Now, in the next video, we'll pick up the story as Frank and Jessie have a family and their son Donald is born, and then some of the events that happen in the 1920s and 30s as that young family grows together.